Don't know about you, but I normally love breakfast. It works well for me. I'm a morning person and I just like getting up and eating food, and that's probably because I just like eating food generally. But it's not always easy, especially when it comes to racing and getting up, 4:30, 5 o'clock start. It's a bit gross. Then you add in that, you've got a race, you've got race nerves, get a bit of a dodgy tummy, you've got a queue for the portaloos. All of that kind of thing makes breakfast a little bit unappealing when you first get up. So what I wanted to talk about today is whether breakfast is actually important before a triathlon and whether it's something you really need to prioritise in your morning routine. We're going to look at some research which gives a bit of information on this and how you can apply it to your racing depending on what distance you're doing and how hard you're going to be racing. So you can work out for yourself just how important it is, or maybe it isn't. So what's up, nutrition nerds, and welcome back to another video. And this is another one of my race nutrition series. As a bit of a reminder, this is a series all about, as the name suggests, triathlon race nutrition. And we're going to cover loads of different topics to help you train, prepare, and race better. So if you haven't already, press the subscribe button and the notification icon to get an alert when I release a new video. So let's talk breakfast and just how important it really is. It's one of those things, and just in normal daily life, everyone says breakfast is so important, and potentially even more so when it comes to racing. So let's talk about whether that's actually true and how much you need to prioritise breakfast in the morning of your race. Now, there's a couple of reasons why breakfast might be important, and that might be along the lines of making sure you've got enough energy to actually do the race and do it as well as possible. It might be to make sure that you don't feel hungry so that doesn't distract you from trying to race hard. It might be to make sure that you're well hydrated, or it might be part of just your normal ritual, so you want to keep it in. But it's not always easy to eat breakfast in the morning before a race, especially if you've already got up early and you're trying to pack your bags, make sure all your kit's ready, stressing about the race, and that just adds to the race nerves and the likelihood that you're going to have to visit the loo a few times in the morning. So let's have a look at some research by Leacy and her colleagues, which puts the question of, is breakfast important, to the test. Now, as always, you can go and read this for yourself if you're interested, but as a brief overview, this was a cycling experiment where participants cycled for 105 minutes at a relatively easy intensity and then went straight into a 10-kilometre time trial. Over the duration of that whole experiment, every 15 minutes, they sipped on either a placebo drink, which means there wasn't any active ingredient which would contribute to improved performance, or they sipped on a carbohydrate-based drink, which they hypothesized might have improved performance. Now, there were 4 different interventions in this. There were 2 tests where participants were fasted in the morning, so they didn't have any breakfast before the test. And then in the test, both of those fasted groups either had a placebo or the carbohydrate drink. And the flip side of that was that they did the same thing, except they had breakfast, and then they either had the placebo or the carbohydrate drink. So essentially, you had the same participants who either didn't have breakfast, so were in a fasted state, and then used a carbohydrate-based drink, or they used a placebo, or they actually had breakfast, and then they still used a carbohydrate-based drink, or they used a placebo. So you can see how that's that breakfast versus no breakfast scenario. Now, the results of this were super interesting. Firstly, when the participants used that carbohydrate-based drink during the trial and the time trial, their performance was significantly improved versus those who used the placebo, and it didn't differ between whether they were fasted or fed. Now, surprisingly, or perhaps unsurprisingly if you've watched some of my videos before, they also found that the group who had breakfast improved their performance when they were fed the carbohydrate-based drink versus when they had breakfast but they were given the placebo drink. So to put that in order of what seemed to perform best, the times when they were fed carbohydrates during the trial, they performed better compared to the ones when they were just fed a placebo. And it didn't seem to matter whether or not they had had breakfast. Now, the second best was the ones who had had breakfast but they were fed a placebo. They weren't able to perform quite as well as when they were given carbohydrates, but it was still very clearly better than those who were exercising in the fasted state. As in, they didn't have any breakfast and they were given a placebo. And it was very clear that when they were fasted and they were given a placebo, it was pretty naff. Now, one of the questions which the authors raised was, why exactly was this and why did they perform better? And there are a few potential reasons. Now, one of them might be because as they were cycling and they were taking in those carbohydrates, that meant that they could save the body's own store of carbohydrates, essentially saving muscle and liver glycogen. Now, it may also have been because as you take in carbohydrates, your body recognises that, and that's important for two reasons. Firstly, because it knows it's getting more, it upregulates, so it increases the amount of carbohydrates it can burn, essentially allowing you to produce more energy at a quicker rate. And that essentially means that you can work harder because your body is more able to provide the energy that you need. The other potential benefit there, which links to taking in the carbohydrates and your body recognising it, is that we know that your brain reacts to taking on carbohydrates and you feel better and more alert. So it might have been that actually made them perform better. Either way, there was a very clear benefit to taking in carbohydrates during this experiment. So in context, while it might not be ideal, this study actually suggests that breakfast might not actually be as important as we once thought. But there are a few caveats and we'll go through that. Now, the first thing to mention is whether there were any limitations to the study. And as always, the answer is yes. The study used male participants and there weren't any females. So we've always got to ask the question of, does this directly translate to females as well? In my opinion, the answer is almost definitely yes. I've talked about this before, but I don't think that fasted training or exercising in the fasted state is particularly good for females on the whole. So I would expect there to be some sort of performance benefit from using carbohydrates. This study also doesn't factor in things like carbohydrate loading. It's unclear whether the results would have been the same, especially when it comes to those who are in the fasted state. It's possible that those who are in the fasted state and had the placebo may have actually performed just as well had they carbohydrate loaded in the days before. But I suspect that probably isn't the case just because we know how important carbohydrates are. Overall, I think this study actually gives some really good insight as to whether or not breakfast may be important before a triathlon. So let's talk about how applicable it actually is to a triathlon and how you can use it. First of all, I think that the most important thing is to consider what kind of triathlon you're actually doing, what distance, and how hard you're going to be racing it. We know that as exercise intensity increases, the amount of carbohydrates you use increases as well. And if you're working hard enough, you essentially only use carbohydrates and you don't use any fat. So I think that means that this is much more applicable to those who are doing long distance racing compared to those who are doing shorter distance racing like sprint triathlons. Remember that those who are in the fasted state who didn't use any carbohydrate supplements during the experiment definitely performed worse than any of the other groups. And if you think about a sprint triathlon where you're essentially going hard from the start, you're not really going to have a chance to get the carbohydrates on board. And that's one of the big caveats of this study, which you've got to keep in mind. Essentially, it seems okay not to have breakfast as long as you can adequately fuel yourself with carbohydrates during whatever exercise you're doing. And in reality, racing a sprint triathlon, you're not really going to have that opportunity. You need to work harder from the start, so you need the carbohydrates available and you need your body to be prepared for that as well, which means having had some sort of carbohydrates before. But I think this might be applicable to an Ironman race because if you think that the intensity that you race at is going to be lower, you've got more opportunity to properly fuel yourself over the race. And because you're working at a lower intensity, you're going to be able to absorb more as well. However, again, it's really worth saying that the caveat to this is that performance doesn't seem to be worse as long as you manage to take in sufficient amount of carbohydrates. Now I'm going to be talking about how to practice your race day nutrition in next week's video, so we'll pick this up a bit more then. But essentially, if you're someone who really does struggle with having breakfast, as long as you can adequately get in enough carbohydrates, you're actually probably okay and not at any disadvantage. But just remember that everyone is different, and the results of one study doesn't mean that that's definitely the case and that it's true. It just gives a good idea. Overall, I think you probably are better off still having some sort of breakfast, but even if that's just something very small, so like a slice of toast, or actually you prefer to just sip on a carbohydrate-based drink, I think that's a good option. So anyway, let's pick this up a bit more in next week's video, which is on the race day nutrition. I hope you found this useful though. I'd love to hear if you have any specific issues with breakfast or whether you find personally it's really important for you. Let me know in the comments. And if you haven't already, I'd really appreciate it if you gave the video a thumbs up and press subscribe to stay up to date with everything that I release. And I'll catch you next time. See ya.